Chapter 7. What is Love? Sammy Lane rode very slowly on her way home from the Matthews place that morning after the stranger had arrived. She started out at her usual reckless gait, but that was because she knew that young Matt was watching her. Once in the timber, the brown pony was pulled to a walk, and by the time they came out into the open again, the little horse, unrebuked by his mistress, was snatching mouthfuls of grass as he strolled across the trail. Sammy was thinking very seriously. Aunt Molly's parting question had stirred the girl deeply. Sammy had seen few people who did not belong in the backwoods. The strangers she had met were hunters or cattlemen, and these had all been in dress and manner not unlike the natives themselves. This man, who had come so unexpectedly out of the mist the night before, was unlike anyone the young woman had ever known before. Like Jed Holland, she felt somehow as if he was a superior being. The Matthews families were different in many ways from those born and raised in the hills, and Sammy's father, too, was different. But this stranger, it was quite as though he belonged to another world. Coming to the big, low gap, the girl looked far away to the blue line of hills miles and miles away. The stranger had come from over there, she thought, and then she fell to wondering what that world beyond the farthest cloud-like ridge was like. Of all the people Sammy had ever known, young Stewart was the only one who had ever seen over the edge of that world to tell her about it. Her father and her friends, the Matthews, never talked of the old days. She had known Ollie from a child. With young Matt, they had gone to and from the old schoolhouse along the same road. Once before Mr. Stewart's death, the boy had gone with his father for a day's visit to the city, and even after had been a hero to his backwoods schoolmates. It was this distinction, really, that first won Sammy's admiration and made them sweethearts before the girl's skirts had touched the tops of her shoes. Before the woman in her was fairly awake, she had promised to be his wife, and they were going away now to live in that enchanted land. Spying an extra choice bunch of grass a few steps to one side of the path, Brownie suddenly turned towards the valley, and the girl's eyes left the distant ridge for the little cabin and the sheep corral in Mutton Hollow. Sammy always spoke of that cabin as young Matt's house, and all unbidden now the thought came, who would live with the big fellow down there in the valley when she was gone far away to make her home with Ollie and his people in the city? An impatient tug at the reins informed Brownie that his mistress was aware of his existence, and for a time the pony was obliged to pass many a luscious bunch of grass. But soon the reins fell slack again. The little horse moved slowly and still more slowly until, by the relaxed figure of his rider, he knew he was safe again to browse on the grass alongside the path. And so, wondering, dreaming, Sammy Lane rode down the trail that morning. The trail that is nobody knows how old. And on the hill back to the Matthews house, a team was standing idle in the middle of a field. At the big rock on the mountainside, where the trail seemed to pause a moment before starting up to the valley, the girl slipped from her saddle and, leaving Brownie to wander at will, climbed to her favorite seat. Half reclined in the warm sunshine, she watched the sheep feeding nearby, and laughed aloud as she saw the lambs with wagging tails greedily sucking at their mother's sides. Nearby, in a black haw bush, a mother bird sat on her nest. A gray mare with a week-old colt following on unsteady legs came over the ridge, and not far away a mother sow with 10 squealing little pigs came out of the timber. Keeping very still, the young woman watched until they disappeared around the mountain. And then, lifting her arms above her head, she stretched her lithe form out upon the warm, rocky couch with the freedom and grace of a wild thing of the woods. Sammy Lane knew nothing of the laws and customs of the so-called best society. Her splendid young womanhood was not the product of those social traditions and rules that killed the instinct of her kind before it was fairly born. She was as free and as physically perfect as any of the free creatures that lived in the hills, and keenly alive to the life that throbbed and surged about her. Her woman's heart and soul responded to the spirit of the season. The droning of the bees and the blossoms that grew in the crannies of the rock, the tinkle, tinkle of the sheep's bells as the flock moved slowly in their feeding, and the soft breathing of Mother Earth was in her ears, while the gentle breeze that stirred her hair came heavily with the smell of growing things. Laying so, she looked far up into the blue sky where a buzzard floated on lazy wings. If she were up there, perhaps she could see the world beyond the hills. And then suddenly a voice came to her, Aunt Molly's voice. "How do you reckon you'll like being a fine lady, Sammy, a living in the city with the big folks?" The girl turned on her side, raising up on one elbow, looked again at Mutton Hollow with its little cabin half hidden in the timber. And as she looked, slowly her rich red life colored her cheek and neck and brow, and with a gesture of impatience, Sammy turned away to her own home on the southern slope of the mountain, just in time to see a young woman ride into the clearing and dismount before the cabin door. It was her friend, Mandy Ford. The girl on the rock whistled to her pony and, mounting, made her way down the hill. All that day the strange guest at the Matthews place was the one topic of conversation between the girls. "Shucks," said Mandy when Sammy had finished a very minute descript of Mr. Howitt. "He's just some revenue, likes as not." Sammy tossed her head. "Revenue? You ought to see 'em. Revenues don't come in such clothes as them, and they don't talk like him neither." "You can't never tell about revenues," retorted the other. "Don't you mind how they fooled everyone over the bend last year? He was just as common, and folks all allowed he was just one of them." "But this one ain't like any one we've ever met up with, and that's just it," returned Sammy. Mandy shook her head. "You say he ain't hunting. He sure ain't buying cattle this time of year, and he ain't wanting to locate a comin' on afoot. What else can he be but revenue?" To which Sammy replied with an unanswerable argument. "Look here, Mandy Ford, you just tell me, would a low-down revenue ask a blessin' like Parson Bigelow's does?" At this, Mandy gave up the case and sang in despair. "Well, what's he doing here, then? 'Tain't likely he's done come into the woods for nothing." "Well, he told old Matt that he was sick and tired of it all," answered the other. "Well, does he look like he's ailing?" Sammy replied slowly. "I don't reckon that's the kind of sickness he meant. And when you look right up close into his eyes, he does appear kind of used up." In connection with this discussion, it was easy to speak of Miss Lane's fairy prospects, for it was not the stranger from the city. And was not Sammy going to live in the land of wonders? The two girls were preparing for the night when Sammy, who was seated on the edge of the bed, paused with one shoe off to ask thoughtfully, "Mandy, what is love anyhow?" Mandy looked surprised. "Well, I reckon you ought to know," she said with a laugh. "Ollie's been hanging around you ever since I can remember." Sammy was struggling with a knot on the other shoelace. "Yeah," she admitted slowly. "I reckon I had ought to know, but what do you say it is, Mandy?" "Why, it's just caring for somebody more'n anyone else in the whole wide world." "Is that all?" The knot was still stubborn. "No, that ain't all. It's going to live with somebody and letting 'em take care of you instead of your own folks." Sammy was still struggling with the knot. And it's a cooking and a scrubbing and a mending for 'em, and sometimes it's a splitting wood and doing chores, and I reckon that's all." Just then the knot came undone and the shoe dropped to the floor with a thud, and Sammy sat upright. "No, it ain't, Mandy. It's a heap more than that. It's nursing babies and taking care of 'em till they're grown up, and then when they're big enough to take care of themselves, you're old and in the way like Grandma Bowles. It's a looking back over it all and being glad that you done married the man you did. It's a heap more than just living with a man, Mandy. It's a doing all that and without ever once wishing he was someone else." Well, this was too much for Mandy. She blushed and giggled and then remarked as she gazed admiringly at her friend, "Well, you look mighty fine, Sammy, when you're all fixed up with them pretties when you and Ollie get married. I wish my hair was as bright and shiny as yours. How do you reckon you'll like being a fine lady anyhow?" Here it was again. Sammy turned upon her helpless friend with, "How would I know if I like it or not? What is being a fine lady anyhow?" "Why, it's being a fine lady is living in a big house with carpets on the floor and looking glasses and not having no work to do and wearing pretty clothes with lots of rings and things and she paused and added with triumph, "and a riding in a carriage." That wide questioning look was in Sammy's eyes as she returned, "It's a heap more than that, Mandy. I don't just sense what it is, but I know it tain't all them things that makes it sure enough, lady. 'Tain't the clothes he wears that makes Mr. Howard different than the folks we know, and he don't wear no rings, and he walks. He's just different 'cause he's different, and would be, no matter what he had on or where he was." This, too, was beyond Mandy. Sammy continued as she finished her preparations for retiring. "This here house is plenty big enough for me. Leastwise, it would be if it had one more room like the cabin in Mutton Hollow. Carpets would be mighty dirty and unhandy to clean when the men come in tramping with their muddy boots. I wouldn't want to wear no dresses so fine I couldn't knock round in the bushes with 'em. And it would be awful to have nothing to do. And as for a carriage, I wouldn't swap Brownie for a whole city full of carriages." She slipped into bed and stretched out luxuriously. "Do you reckon I could be a fine lady and be just as I am now, living here in the hills?" The next day Mandy went back to her home on Jake Creek, and in the evening Sammy's father with Wash Gibbs returned, both men and horses showing the effects of a long, hard ride. End of chapter 7.